Have we ever wondered why those talented black artists died so quietly and prematurely, right at the height of their fame? The truth is, Hollywood has another side that it never wants us to see. It's not the spotlight, but syringes and tranquilizers handed to 15-year-olds just to give them the energy to perform and rake in money for their bosses. They are hailed as legends, yet a genius lies motionless on a cold Harlem floor with a needle still embedded in his arm. They are celebrated as icons, yet they are forced to end their lives in shame by taking handfuls of sleeping pills because they weren't allowed to share a bathroom with white people. They call it death from illness, but leaked photos from the scene tell a far more brutal story. These are images of lips turning purple from drug overdoses, dark scars running down arms concealed by thick layers of makeup. Hollywood has spent vast sums of money hiding this evidence, fearing we would learn that they exploited the most iconic figures of color like frivolous commodities, then discarded them in solitude the moment the lights went out. Today, we will revisit those sealed files, confronting the truth through 23 photos of black celebrities' addictions that Hollywood has always tried to conceal. In the memories of us older generations, Valida Snow will forever remain a proud icon, her trumpet playing igniting the Harlem skyline. But behind that dazzling brilliance lies a painful reality that Hollywood has painstakingly concealed for half a century. The final photograph, secretly taken at a luxury hotel in May 1956, is not a portrait of a diva resting, but living proof of a body utterly ravaged. Just hours before her final collapse, an anonymous paparazzi infiltrated the back room of the Palace Hotel in New York. The candid photograph taken that night is the most gruesome evidence of a self-destructive genius. Valida was not prepared to perform. She lay listlessly on a velvet armchair, her face stiff as wax and her eyes vacant, the suffocating state of someone who had chosen opium as their only escape. This was the sordid secret she kept hidden. Valida had enslaved herself to chemicals, and Hollywood simply seized that chain to operate the money-making machine on a decaying body. On the night of May 30th, 1956, when Valida breathed her last, the press hastily released a death certificate stating, "Exhaustion, a cheap cover-up for a blatant death by drug overdose." The medical truth in the leaked photograph was far more filthy. Under the harsh flash of the camera, her skin was glistening with toxic sweat, and around her neck were clearly visible purplish-red patches, the classic sign of a chemical overdose that instantly paralyzed her respiratory system. The distorted smile on her lips was not art, but the mechanical convulsion of an addict who had just taken her last dose of drugs to find a false sense of euphoria. Hollywood cremated her body just 24 hours later without an autopsy, a staged act to cover up traces of her addiction and protect revenue from upcoming releases. A scandalous photograph of the scene leaked to the tabloids before the record label's lawyer bought the negative to destroy it. It exposed the truth that her later memoir would admit. Valida herself had plunged into the abyss of drug addiction after the war. That self-inflicted addiction became the noose that forced her to perform until her last drop of blood. Valida Snow did not die from natural illness. She died from the poison she herself injected into her bloodstream. She passed away alone at the palace, leaving behind a photograph of her addiction, her eyes wide open, staring at her own deceit. In the glamorous world of the 1950s, Joyce Bryant was dubbed the Black Marilyn Monroe with her dazzling silver blonde hair. But behind that glamour lay a dark secret. To maintain her legendary hair color, Hollywood forced her to diet with high concentrations of silver nitrate, a chemical originally intended for industrial use. This poison seeped through her scalp into her bloodstream and ravaged her nervous system day by day. To remain on stage with a body screaming from heavy metal poisoning, Joyce actively sought refuge in the abyss of addiction. She became a slave to high doses of opioids, the dosage increasing with the level of damage the chemicals inflicted on her bloodstream. A candid, behind-the-scenes photo from 1953, which record companies later spent a fortune destroying, reveals a sordid reality. It was no longer the radiant diva, but the image of Joyce Bryant slumped in the dressing room, eyes wide open, body convulsing from a painkiller overdose. Just before a performance. Under the harsh flashes, her skin was grayish, glistening with toxic sweat, a typical sign of an overdose of chemicals to suppress excruciating pain. Hollywood knew Joyce was dying from addiction and poisoning, but as long as her gray hair continued to generate money, they nonchalantly continued to pump drugs into her, nurturing her addiction to keep the merchandise from collapsing in front of the cameras. Her mysterious disappearance in the midst of her career, what the media called the escape to the convent, was in fact a desperate escape from a predetermined death sentence. Joyce Bryant fled not out of mere piety, but because she understood that if she stayed, she would die of organ failure from drug abuse before she could see the dawn. Leaked photos of her drug-induced stupor and the chemical scars on her scalp will forever be an indictment of Hollywood's cruelty, where beauty is extracted from venom and artists' lives are buried under a deceptive glare of colored lights.
What would you do if the angelic voice you adored was really a child's cry for help, abandoned by Hollywood to heroin amid roaring applause?
The photograph, taken in the early morning of February 27, 1968, in his grandmother's cramped bathroom in Harlem, is the most gruesome evidence of how Hollywood devoured child prodigies. At age 25, Frankie Lyman, once hailed as the Michael Jackson of the 1950s, lay motionless on the cold tile floor with a syringe still lodged in his vein. This was the very needle mark that entertainment moguls had spent vast sums of money to erase from the headlines, for it exposed a cruel truth. They had allowed a child to sink into the abyss of heroin addiction from the age of 15, as long as his lucrative singing career continued. This downfall was not an accident, but a foregone conclusion from his final performance in London not long before. In the leaked backstage footage, the audience no longer sees a quick-witted prodigy, but only a lifeless body with vacant stares, pupils constricted to the size of pinheads under the harsh lights. A typical sign of having just taken a massive dose of heroin to create a false sense of euphoria before going on air. Frankie couldn't stand steady, his body trembling violently between notes. He had deliberately chosen chemicals to maintain his false sobriety in the face of the indifference of the show promoters. Hollywood knew Frankie was decaying, but instead of saving him, they chose to drain this money-making machine with a grueling touring schedule. The 1968 bathroom photo was the trigger that exposed the hypocrisy of the entertainment industry. While newspapers at the time hailed his death as an artistic loss, a leaked photograph from a crime scene investigator's film revealed a stark reality. Gaunt, gray skin and dark scars running down his arm, the result of a decade of untreated injection abuse. Hollywood feared this photograph because it proved they had abandoned him in poverty and addiction in the very place where he was born. Frankie Lyman's death with the syringe still in his arm remains a powerful indictment of the price of fame and the cruelty of a system willing to sacrifice a human life to protect glamorous recordings. In the entertainment world, Dinah Washington will forever be a powerful queenie, but a press photograph of the night she died in 1963 at her home tells a story tainted by the drugs that Hollywood has deliberately tried to conceal. Instead of the image of a diva passing away with dignity, this rare photo from Jet magazine exposes a chaotic reality. A room littered with empty bottles of high-concentration weight loss pills and tranquilizers scattered across sweat-soaked bedsheets. This is the trigger that exposed the cruelty of the entertainment empire at the time. Those who forced a powerful woman into a labyrinth of drug abuse to maintain her appearance according to the harsh standards of the entertainment industry. The stark truth about Dinah was that her final years were filled with chronic dry mouth and uncontrollable tremors, a direct consequence of prolonged high-concentration drug use. Candid photos taken backstage showed the Queen constantly drinking water, her face swollen from fluid retention from chemicals, her eyes glazed over and unfocused just before she stepped onto the stage to deliver those dazzling high notes. Hollywood knew her health was on the brink of collapse, but instead of helping, they chose to quickly clean up the scene before reporters arrived, trying to erase the vials of medication to make her death from an overdose appear as a natural stroke in order to protect her reputation and unfinished recording contracts. The photos of the empty vials next to Dinah's body are the strongest indictment of Hollywood's calculated indifference. They didn't care how her heart was being ravaged by the chemicals. They only needed her to be thin enough to fit into her glamorous dresses and alert enough to complete her tour schedule. Dinah Washington's death in a room filled with empty pill bottles remains a heartbreaking testament to how a free spirit was transformed into a drug addict under the covert patronage of the very people who propelled her to fame. This version sounds more truthful and realistic. The final paparazzi photograph taken at Slugs Club in 1972 didn't capture a trumpet prodigy lost in the music, but rather the moment a soul had been brutally devoured by the white powder. Just before his common-law wife Helen fired the final shot, Lee Morgan appeared in the frame like a ghostly figure wandering through the world. Despite his elegant suit, his face was expressionless, his eyes vacant, his pupils abnormally constricted, an undeniable medical sign of high-dose use just before a performance. It was this dehumanized state of intoxication that transformed his violent shove of Helen, the woman who had painstakingly saved every penny to buy him his trumpet, into a fatal blow to the audience's compassion, elevating the tragedy to the peak of outrage and disgust. Hollywood attempted to stage Lee's death as a blind, jealousy-fueled attack to protect the value of his remaining recordings, but this leaked photo exposed the sordid truth that record labels always try to erase with money. Under the relentless flash, Lee's skin revealed the gray, gaunt appearance of someone being consumed by chemicals from within. But the most chilling aspect was the calloused scars crisscrossing his wrists and the bruises on his veins, ironclad evidence of a dark past that silently shackled this genius. Hollywood knew Lee was sinking into the mire of addiction, but instead of saving him, they chose to tolerate it, as long as his lips could still produce music that would generate money for their profit-making machine. Lee's violent and ruthless outburst in that moment was not his true nature, but the frenzied resistance of a nervous system rotted by high-dose drug abuse. The photograph of Lee Morgan with his vacant stare and visible needle marks is a powerful indictment of the calculated indifference of the entertainment empire at the time. They watched a legend self-destruct in a chemical delirium, and then, when the shot was fired, they casually discarded him like expired goods. Lee Morgan died not just from a bullet, but from a system that drained his soul and left him to collapse on stage, no longer truly human. The candid photograph taken at Wynton Kelly's final performance wasn't a moment of triumph for a piano master, but rather a negative capturing the collapse of a life right on the piano keys. At 40, the artist who had accompanied the greatest legends appeared with a chilling look. A haggard face, vacant eyes with cloudy whites, staring blankly in a chemical delirium. Kelly sat there, head tilted back and jaw drooping unconsciously, a typical state of hypotonia in someone deeply immersed in high-intensity hallucinations, completely disconnected from reality even as his fingers remained on the black and white keys. This was the stark price of using chemicals to sustain creativity, a reality Hollywood had tried every technique to transform into an artistic wanderlust. The truth about Kelly's devastating addiction lay in his precious hands, the very hands that the camera flashes had inadvertently and mercilessly exposed. The veins on the back of his hands were bulging, hardened, and crisscrossed with tiny, dark scars along the blood vessels, a bloody indictment of years of endless injections. His fingertips were slightly swollen, trembling violently as he clung to the piano, not for inspiration, but to keep his body from collapsing onto the stage floor. Under the harsh studio lights, his gray skin covered in a layer of oily, cold sweat, and his dark, cracked lips betrayed the complete breakdown of his autonomic nervous system. Kelly was dying from chronic oxygen deprivation amidst the applause of the audience, who were unaware that their idol was breathing his last breath into music with a decaying body. Hollywood sealed off his medical records that night to protect his image as a dedicated artist, but they couldn't erase the truth of his solitary death at the hotel shortly after the performance. Kelly didn't die peacefully in his sleep. He died of a sudden drop in blood pressure, the inevitable consequence of an overdose of medication that his already weakened body could no longer withstand. The entertainment industry's manipulation of his survival into a work of art was the ultimate act of cruelty, exploiting even the sudden death of a black artist to continue selling clean recordings. Wynton Kelly is gone, leaving a vast void on the piano keyboard and an indictment of an era where talent was drained by chemicals and then cast into the shadows of oblivion. That night on 7th Avenue, amidst a crowd gathered for autographs, a dry clack echoed, silencing the neighborhood. Sonny Stitt's wallet fell. Instantly, packets of white powder scattered across the pavement, right at the feet of the patrol officer. In a split second, the image of a disciplined, clean artist that Stitt had painstakingly cultivated crumbled. As the handcuffs tightened, Stitt screamed about a cowardly setup. His plea of innocence plunged the public into doubt. Was this a trap to bring down a rebellious black icon, or had his moral mask finally fallen? All his explanations were laughable in the face of irrefutable evidence. The single paparazzi photograph capturing that moment. Under the blinding flash of the cameras, Stitt's face displayed a look anyone who had ever seen an addict would instantly recognize: the delirious enjoyment of someone heavily intoxicated. His pupils had shrunk to the size of a pinhead, a stark medical sign betraying all his oaths of innocence. This candid photograph exposed a horrifying reality. Behind the elegant suit lay a nervous system being subjected to chemical abuse, leaving him devoid of panic or fear, only a vacant, emotionless gaze at a crumbling reality. Although later released due to lack of evidence, Stitt's soul was frozen in that fateful frame. Those who have experienced enough of life understand one truth. The truth isn't in the newspapers. It lies in the undeniable details of the body. Whether Stitt was truly framed or a secret addict remains a dark question mark, but his vacant eyes that night are an indictment of an era in which black artists were relentlessly scrutinized. Hollywood may have saved him from prison, but they nonchalantly allowed that photo to destroy the reputation of a legend. A costly lesson about the price of freedom when one dares to step outside the rules set by those in power. Leaked photos from backstage are a heartbreaking testament to the perfect facade that long-sleeve shirts with cufflinks have tried to conceal for decades. Amidst the sweltering heat of underground clubs, while Hollywood lauded Hampton Hawes as an icon of aristocratic elegance, the candid photos exposed a painful reality hidden beneath the luxurious silk fabric. Beneath those cuffs was not radiant masculinity, but rather dark, raised scars crisscrossing hardened blood vessels, the result of relentless heroin injections to maintain a false sense of alertness during endless nights of performances. This revealing photograph shows a tragic hidden side. With his hands exhausted and his main veins gradually necrotic from the abuse of injections, Hawes had to grit his teeth and endure physical pain to find the most inconspicuous spots on his body, from between his toes to his groin, to directly inject the drug into his bloodstream. Under the flashlights, his face was drenched in sweat, his skin pale and gray from exhaustion, but his eyes were wide open with pupils as small as pinheads. the state of someone struggling against heat stroke under thick clothing to protect the image of a clean artist imposed by his bosses. Hollywood knew about these festering needle marks, but instead of offering help, they chose to seal off all close-up footage of his hands, forcing him to wear long-sleeve shirts as a form of imprisonment to protect the revenue from an addicted genius. The most haunting detail is his swollen hands with trembling, bluish fingertips, the inevitable consequence of circulatory collapse due to the abuse of opioid painkillers and high doses of tranquilizers. Hollywood cleverly transformed his posture of clinging to the railing to prevent his body from collapsing into an artistic, immersive pose, but in reality, it was the extraordinary willpower of a man clinging to life amidst a lingering drug overdose. Hampton Hawes did not die of old age, but breathed his last in 1977 from radical organ failure, the result of a lifetime chained to heroin and other drugs, then covered with a veil of deceptive silk. His story is not an indictment of an artist, but a powerful condemnation of the cruel price of addiction manipulated by those in power in the entertainment industry. The Wizard of Six Strings was the glamorous title the media at the time bestowed upon Grant Green, but that velvet curtain was torn apart by an unexpected and sordid reality. The heart of the shocking 1965 scandal didn't come from music, but from a cruel black-and-white candid photograph on the cover of the infamous tabloid Confidential. The photo exposed the legend, slumped pathetic, on a pile of dilapidated equipment behind a dimly lit club. His face was ashen, his eyes vacant and lifeless, and most horrifyingly, his golden hands trembling violently, unable to fasten his cufflinks, a collapse of image that shocked anyone who picked up the newspaper. American public opinion immediately fell into a fierce psychological battle because Grant Green was a symbol of iron discipline, possessing one of the cleanest and most logical guitar-playing styles in the jazz world. When the tabloid newspaper flooded newsstands, his representatives immediately released a clarification about exhaustion after 48 hours of recording to appease the public. 80% of the public clung to this explanation as a lifeline to protect their idol, but the newspaper delivered a fatal blow with a series of photos of dubious prescription bills and evidence of him frequently disappearing for 15 minutes between sets, only to return in a deranged state of euphoria from drug injections. The photos in the newspaper were like a dagger to the audience's trust, questioning how a brain with such clear musical thinking could allow its body to fall into such a humiliating and disoriented state. In reality, the cleanliness of Blue Note's classic recordings was merely a cruel mental shield that Hollywood erected to cover a soul devoured by addiction, aiming to squeeze every last drop of sweat from his golden fingers. Under the relentless flash of the paparazzi, the candid photograph inadvertently exposed undeniable, cold medical signs. Grant Green's eyes, with pupils narrowed to the size of a pinhead, ironclad evidence of high-intensity drug use, stood a horrifying contrast with his oily, sweaty skin, even as he sat in the cold darkness of the alley. A subtle hint lay in the spaces between his fingers, crudely magnified in the newspaper, revealing dark bruises and swelling at the joints. This was a sign of peripheral neuropathy from prolonged intravenous drug abuse. Although the kingpins used their power to suppress the story in mainstream newspapers, the tabloid's print remains a cruel, black indictment, proving that even the purest sounds can sprout from the ultimate decay of a hidden addiction. Loliata Holloway's final photograph is a horrifying testament to her terminal heroin addiction, secretly taken as she was wheeled out of a dilapidated Chicago hotel in 2011 on a rickety stretcher. No longer the dazzling diva, she lay motionless, her face swollen and disfigured, the inevitable consequence of decades of liver and kidney failure filtering out the toxic drug. This was the dark secret she had actively chosen. Loliata had enslaved herself to white powder and high-dose sedatives to sustain her euphoric hallucinations, while Hollywood nonchalantly seized this chain of addiction to drain her voice. Under the cruel flash of the camera, the photograph exposed a disgusting truth. Open sores around her nose and lips, a characteristic sign of tissue necrosis in long-term users of pure heroin. But the most striking detail lies in her wide-open eyes with pupils as narrow as a pinhead. This is irrefutable medical evidence, revealing a large dose of opioids paralyzing her nervous system as she lay dying. At the scene, the hotel room reeked of drug solvents and littered the sweat-soaked bedsheets with empty tranquilizer vials. Hollywood announced she died of heart failure, a blatant lie to cover up the sordid forensic report. Leaked photos revealed an even more horrifying reality. The veins in her neck and groin were hardened and blackened by necrosis from direct injections into the last remaining major blood vessels after her limbs had already been mutilated by needles. Loleatta Holloway did not die from natural illness. She died from the ravages of poison she herself injected into her bloodstream with the tacit approval of her superiors. She passed away alone, leaving behind a photograph of the scene that serves as a powerful indictment of a legend who fell victim to the guns of drugs and the brutality of the entertainment industry. In the summer of 1977, just before the start of a Paris haute couture show, a scandal shattered the glamorous dreams of the modeling world. Peggy Dillard, a promising model trapped in the shadow of Beverly Johnson, became the spark when she publicly accused the star of abusing high doses of cocaine to maintain her ethereal, cool demeanor. Peggy claimed to have witnessed Beverly using white powder to force arousal from her exhausted body. But Hollywood and the design moguls chose the most cruel method. They immediately removed Peggy Dillard from the show, condemning her career on all major runways, turning her into a jealous slanderer, protecting the iconic Beverly. The truth seemed to be buried forever, until a Polaroid photograph of the makeup layout, taken from the Hell Mirror, leaked out. This photograph is a fatal flaw in the system. It captures Beverly Johnson through a corner of a mirror reflecting off the vanity table behind the velvet curtain. There, next to her luxurious powder compact, lies a silver dish containing cocaine residue and a rolled-up banknote, horrifying evidence of drug use just before a runway show. While Beverly smiles brightly in the frontal shot, her reflection betrays a screaming, trapped soul. Her eyes appear vacant, with dilated pupils, mydriasis, a horrifying medical sign of extreme cocaine-induced nervous system stimulation, causing the eyeballs to lose their natural reflexes. The final blow lies in her hands. Beverly grips the edge of the table so tightly that her veins bulge like worms, a vasoconstriction and a surge in heart rate due to the high concentration of cocaine wreaking havoc within her bloodstream, turning her into a ticking time bomb. This photograph escaped the frantic hunt of security forces through a chilling scenario. The makeup artist hid the Polaroid photo between an old magazine pages and threw it into a trash can backstage. An Italian paparazzi photographer rummaged through the waste and found this black treasure, exposing the sordid truth. Peggy Dillard was right, but she was crushed by the system in exchange for a truth no one dared admit. Beverly Johnson continued to shine, but that radiance was forever tainted by the white smoke of death and the high price a colleague paid to expose it. A paparazzi photo taken secretly in a cheap Los Angeles studio in 1980 forever shattered the elegant image of the gentleman of Motown. James Jamerson sat slumped over his legendary precision guitar, not in artistic ecstasy, but in a body ravaged by the late stages of heroin addiction. After being discarded by his record label as a discarded piece of equipment, he turned to drugs to stop the tremors in his hands, which had suffered severe nerve damage. This wasn't a weak choice, but a desperate escape of a genius drained by the very white substance. The physical signs in that photo were an undeniable medical indictment. Under the dim light, Jamerson's face was darkened, his teeth almost all gone. the devastating consequences of prolonged intravenous heroin abuse that left his body unable to absorb nutrients. Most horrifying were the hands of this treasure of world music, swollen, purple, and involuntarily contracting finger joints. This was the consequence of drug abuse and high doses of tranquilizers to force his nervous system to function. James deliberately mixed strong alcohol with high-concentration tranquilizers to play his final notes, turning himself into a drug-induced zombie under the cold gaze of Hollywood promoters. In 1983, when his last breath faded, Hollywood hastily issued a death certificate stating cirrhosis, a clean label to cover up the secret of a neglected addict. But the hospital photos revealed a sordid truth. A man emaciated, his face so disfigured that doctors couldn't recognize him. A legend with hundreds of hit songs died like a homeless person, penniless with no one by his side. Hollywood sealed his forensic records to continue selling flashy album covers, while in reality, they nonchalantly allowed heroin and drugs to devour Jamerson to the bone. This wasn't just a death. It was a powerful indictment of how a black genius was treated like a disposable commodity, squeezed dry of blood and then cast into obscurity. In the summer of 1961, a brutal, candid photograph in a French newspaper dismembered Sarah Vaughan's glamorous image, forever erasing the image of a dazzling goddess on stage. The photo captured her collapsing outside a Parisian club, her face completely disfigured, her mouth agape, and her gaze empty like a lifeless corpse. This was the moment the sordid truth about her high-dose cocaine addiction was exposed to the relentless glare of paparazzi, stripping bare the facade that her fans had painstakingly constructed. The truth seemed buried under lies about food poisoning or hypoglycemia, until the newspaper released a photographic indictment showing discarded cocaine wrappers and syringes hastily thrown into a trash can in the private entrance reserved for the diva. Hollywood and its producers turned Sarah into a chemical-fueled singing machine, forcing her to receive injections right before showtime to maintain her legendary high notes, despite her heart screaming under the overwhelming pressure of the cocaine. The photograph taken in Paris that year inadvertently captured the horrific medical signs that the system had deliberately concealed for decades through promotional footage. Sarah's lips appeared abnormally purple and swollen, a chilling testament to cyanosis caused by acute hypoxia and respiratory failure from the shock of the cocaine. High doses of cocaine paralyzed her respiratory center and caused extreme vasoconstriction, forcing the legendary diva to struggle for breath on the cold Parisian sidewalk, while her facial muscles sagged and her eyes were open but unfocused, a typical state of a soul trapped in the delirious darkness of the drug. The most haunting detail lies in the expensive fur coat that has slipped to one side, revealing the upper arm with crisscrossing devil's scars along the veins under the harsh flash of light. These fresh and old bruises are the undeniable evidence of long-term cocaine abuse, a brutal reality never seen in those receiving conventional medical treatment. This photograph will forever be a stark indictment, proving that behind the glamour of the jazz queen was a body being ravaged hour by hour by the cruelty of the Hollywood machine and the merciless poison of cocaine. The Challenger of Limits is the glamorous title Hollywood media used to frame Raymond St. Jacques. But behind that dignified facade lay a tragedy of chemical manipulation. A post-awards party, supposed to be a moment of glory, turned into a career purge when the tabloid Confidential released a shocking candid photo. The camera captured Paul Winfield, a powerful figure in the film industry, pointing his finger directly at St. Jacques. While Winfield blazed with majestic rage, St. Jacques appeared dazed, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror, like someone who had just lost their soul. Winfield's ominous words shattered the glamorous atmosphere. "Your talent is being consumed by each dose of opium. You are a disgrace to the black artistic bloodline." American public opinion immediately fell into a fierce psychological battle. On one side was Winfield, An icon of composure, on the other was Saint Jacques, a rising star, the perfect successor. When Saint Jacques clarified that this was merely a petty act of revenge stemming from a rivalry over a role, 80% of the public sided with him, believing Winfield was intimidated by a younger actor. However, that black-and-white photograph contained details that sent shivers down the spines of the medical community, exposing the sordid truth behind the name of a rising giant. Under the relentless flash of the paparazzi, Saint Jacques' body delivered an undeniable indictment. Despite the intense light shining directly on his face, his eyes dilated to their maximum, a condition known as pupil freezing syndrome, proving that his central nervous system had been paralyzed by high concentrations of stimulants such as cocaine or amphetamines. The loss of motor control was evident in his hands, gripping the table so tightly that the veins bulged, yet his fingers trembled unusually, betraying the feigned composure he tried to maintain to mask the simmering drug-induced shock within. The most haunting detail, a hidden, deadly mark, lies in the slightly unbuttoned collar of Saint Jacques' shirt. The Leica lens captured a small skin-colored bandage hastily applied to a vein in his neck. This is the final destination for heavy addicts, where the veins in their arms have hardened and necrotized from prolonged injections. Paul Winfield wasn't envious. He was screaming in disgust at a genius who had accepted being a chemical puppet for the drug lords in exchange for illusory fame. Hollywood spent a fortune buying the rights to the photo to destroy it, but the pirated copies from the tabloid remain haunting evidence of a bloody and drug-fueled generational shift, where truth was cast aside in favor of box office profits. The Fiery Rose of the blaxploitation genre was the glamorous title the media of the 1970s used to praise Frida Payne. But in reality, it was merely a polished facade concealing a horrific crime etched right on film. The suspicion didn't stem from a paparazzi photo, but from the most valuable close-up shot in the film Book of Numbers, 1973. While critics hailed it as the pinnacle of physical performance, the tabloid Confidential delivered a fatal blow by claiming Frida wasn't acting. She was genuinely high on drugs right in front of the camera, and this was one of the most cleverly concealed images of drug addiction under the guise of art. This shock sparked a heated public debate. In the climactic scene, instead of the actress's suffering, the audience shudders at the complete absence of soul behind Frida's eyes. The director and studio tried to justify this by claiming she used method acting, staying up all night to achieve the emaciated appearance. 80% of the public believed this selfless sacrifice until leaked outtakes revealed Frida collapsing like a log the moment the director shouted, "Cut." The sordid truth lay in the medical signs that Hollywood forces deliberately ignored to capture the most real moments on a decaying body in order to maximize profits. Upon reviewing the original footage, one cannot help but be horrified by her vacant stare. Frida's eyes were wide open, her pupils constricted to the size of a pinhead, and she did not blink at all during the 2 minutes of filming despite the constantly changing intensity of the studio lights. That wasn't acting. It was the paralysis of the nervous system under the onslaught of chemicals. In addition, her lips constantly moved unconsciously, dry, and her swallowing was difficult, typical symptoms of dehydration and excessive nervous stimulation caused by amphetamine. But the real Achilles heel lay in a frame where Frida raised her hand to cover her face. Beneath the thick layer of makeup on her upper arm, the camera still captured a bright red swelling, the mark of a slightly infected injection site. This was the most compelling evidence of the drug addiction that Hollywood had kept secret. The moguls had used their absolute power to force the post-production team to edit and blur this scar, to erase the evidence of exploitation before the film's release. This unjust struggle shows that Frida was merely a pawn in the hands of the underworld, those willing to sacrifice the actress's life for expensive footage. The original film print, remains a bloody indictment of a neglected genius who sacrificed his sanity to become prey to the insatiable greed of the Hollywood machine.
Is the artist's peaceful smile a post-show rest, or the face of a corpse, lost to overdose and indifference?
In the winter of 1967, in the hot, powder-scented backstage of the famous Harlem Circus in Havana, a candid photograph inadvertently captured Leon Claxton's death sentence. In the frame, Claxton, dubbed the Challenger of Death, is flashing a radiant smile, holding his costume mask just before performing his iconic acrobatic jump. But that smile was merely a facade, a mask concealing a ravaged body. Look closely at the old wooden table beside him, a layer of white dust, like the devil's salt, the potent chemical Hollywood used to operate its money-making machine on the blood and tears of this black artist. Just weeks after that deceptive moment of joy, Leon died suddenly, his death hastily attributed to natural causes on his forensic report. A young reporter once tried to uncover the sordid truth behind that white powder, but the power of the entertainment moguls immediately shredded his article and fired him from the industry after only 4 hours. That's how Hollywood nailed the truth to the shadows, turning the death of a genius into a tightly sealed secret to maintain the false glamour of the circus. The truth only surfaced from the abyss decades later, through the tearful confession of a former colleague in Tampa. Leon Claxton wasn't brave. He was merely a chemical puppet chained to the euphoria of high doses of stimulants to suppress his fear instincts. On the night that photograph was taken, before the most dangerous performance of his career, Leon had ingested an overdose beyond his tolerance. The smile in the photo wasn't joy, but the chemical ecstasy of a melting nervous system. If you looked directly into Leon's eyes under the dim light of a desk lamp, you would see a terrifying abyss. His eyes were wide open, his pupils dilated to their maximum extent, mydriasis. Irrefutable evidence of a brain controlled by the screaming effects of drugs, devoid of any natural light reflexes. Look down at his neck and jaw. The muscles were bulging, tense like overstretched steel cables. This was muscle rigidity, an unconscious bodily reaction during a high-concentration chemical shock, a stark contrast to the calm demeanor he tried to project. But the real vulnerability lay in his bare back, reflected in the mirror. Beneath the stark white makeup were tiny dark scars and ruptured blood vessels along his spine. These were the marks of direct injections of stimulants into the spinal cord, a slow, self-destructive method to force his already weakened legs to dance. That 1967 photograph will forever remain a shattered mask, exposing a genius exploited to the very last cell by Hollywood in exchange for the bloodthirsty applause of the crowd. In February 1972, at a New York club reeking of death and smoke, a broken piano became the execution ground for a genius. Bobby Timmons slumped his head on the scratched keys. The audience went wild, thinking he was in character, but a secretly taken photograph that night exposed the sordid reality. Bobby wasn't acting. He was collapsing from an overdose of amphetamines, the cheap fuel his pimps had pumped into his bloodstream to force his failing biological machine to play fiery soul jazz notes. Hollywood operated its cover-up machine with the speed of an executioner. Instead of an ambulance, they opted for the back door to dispose of this defective item in the hospital in the dark. Witnesses that night were immediately bought off to erase evidence of the dry white streaks at the corners of Timmons's mouth, a sign of a horrific drug-induced anaphylactic shock. They sealed his acute kidney failure medical records not to save face, but to ensure the cash flow from his upcoming recordings wouldn't be interrupted. To the moguls, Bobby wasn't a human being. He was a chemical puppet, needing temporary patching to continue generating money. This cold-blooded cover-up directly sealed his fate at age 39. The fateful 1972 photograph was a medical indictment that was ignored. his precious hands with purple fingertips due to stagnant blood circulation. Drugs helped him create his frenzied melodies, but they also turned his kidneys into two rotting sponges under the pressure of chemicals. The most haunting detail, something Hollywood's glitz and glamour couldn't erase, was the loss of control of his facial muscles captured by the camera, white scabs around his lips and incessant twitching. It was the scream of a burnt-out nervous system. Bobby Timmons' death in 1974, under the guise of dedication, was in fact the final note of a slave contract. Hollywood chose to protect the lifeless vinyl records instead of saving a heart shattered by the weight of the white substance. Do you have the courage to look through the pink powder and confront a zombie languishing under the dazzling studio lights? In 1974, a photo shoot for the blockbuster Claudine inadvertently became the scene of a famous murder. The camera captured the moment Diane Carroll collapsed, not from exhaustion after hours of rehearsals, but from a high-dose anesthetic overdose right in the middle of the frame. Horrified by this incriminating evidence of depravity, the studio immediately ordered all negatives burned. But a darkroom assistant risked his life to preserve the flawed print, the most carefully sealed photograph of addiction in history, exposing the sordid truth hidden behind the glamour of a star. The cruelty of Hollywood is clearly evident in the way they operated the Claudine studio like a slaughterhouse of human dignity. To force Diane into the role of a struggling mother with an exhausting filming schedule, her bosses pushed her into the abyss of opioids and high doses of tranquilizers. Director John Barry was horrified to witness her staggering around like a lost soul on set, while crew members repeatedly found empty vials of medication for terminally ill cancer patients hidden in the makeup room. Instead of taking her to the hospital, the bosses chose to remain silent, continuing to pump chemical fuel to keep Diane running, turning her into a commodity exploited for revenue and prestigious awards. The leaked photo from that year is the medical indictment that Hollywood desperately wants to erase from public memory. Under the intense studio lights, Diane's eyes were vacant, her pupils constricted to the size of pinheads, completely devoid of their natural dilation and constriction, a horrifying testament to the central nervous system's complete paralysis from high doses of drugs. Even more disturbing was the frozen state of movement captured by the camera, her hands awkwardly twitching midway through an attempt to smooth her hair, a complete breakdown in motor control due to the effects of the drugs. Particularly horrifying was the ash-gray skin visible beneath the thick layer of foundation, creating a bizarre contrast with her luxurious attire. The truth only truly came to light when leaked autopsy records revealed alarmingly high levels of narcotics in her blood for decades. Her Oscar nomination that year turned out not to be the pinnacle of her artistic achievement, but the final note in a chemical slavery contract. Hollywood is willing to destroy a photograph to protect its brand, but nonchalantly leaves the artist to burn themselves to ashes in lonely darkness. Tammy Terrell's death at age 24 was not simply a death from a brain tumor. It was the end of a body ravaged by the venom of drugs as she tried to use them to silence the screams of her nerves. A candid photograph taken as she was being wheeled into the ambulance in Virginia in 1967 exposed a sordid reality. As her iconic lace glove slipped off, the camera captured a series of dark scars and fresh needle marks along the veins of her slender hands. This was evidence that Tammy had actively sought out heroin and opioid painkillers as a lifeline to combat the excruciating headaches caused by the malignant tumor, all so she could complete her sweet love songs for the record label. Under the harsh glare of the flashlights, Tammy's face was expressionless, her eyes wide open despite the brightness. A typical state of a nervous system completely paralyzed by a powerful dose of sedatives. In the Motown Muse's handbag that night was not just makeup, but an arsenal of banned chemicals. Tammy had turned herself into a drug-induced puppet due to the immense physical torment. She couldn't sing, couldn't laugh without the chemicals running through her bloodstream to suppress the pain that tormented her day and night. Hollywood knew she was self-destructing through injections, but instead of taking her for surgery, they chose to remain silent, letting her continue injecting to keep their golden goose from collapsing on stage. The photograph of Tammy's hands, riddled with needle marks, is a powerful indictment of the cruelty of the entertainment industry. Hollywood swiftly sealed all medical records and immediately cremated the body to conceal the truth about a legend who died from a drug overdose while trying to escape the pain of her illness. The stark reality is that Tammy Terrell passed away in a chemical delirium, leaving a huge question mark over whether the tumor killed her or whether the system's indifference allowed her to inject poison into herself until her last breath. The Ill-Fated Rose of Soul is the poignant title bestowed upon Linda Jones, but behind her death at the age of 28 lay an elaborate deception. On March 14, 1972, after soaring high notes that shook the Apollo Theater, a candid backstage photograph captured Linda lying on a sofa, a faint smile on her lips as if she were drifting off to sleep. Hollywood used this very serenity to fabricate a humane death due to diabetic complications, but the leaked photo later tore through the veil, exposing a murder committed with indifference and the white powder. The cruelty lay in the fact that Linda wasn't asleep. She was in a permanent coma from chemotherapy. The promoters at the Apollo Theater were so accustomed to seeing Linda use fuel to squeeze out her last drops of sweat for performances that they took her unconscious state for granted. Leaving her in the cold dressing room without any medical supervision solely to protect the image of a fiery diva instead of acknowledging her as a victim of a drug-fueled labor exploitation system. That fateful photograph, when examined from a medical perspective, became a powerful indictment of Hollywood's deception. Beneath her feigned, calm smile, Linda's lips and fingertips had turned a deep purple, a horrifying sign of cyanosis. This was evidence of respiratory failure, oxygen no longer reaching the tissues due to the high-concentration drug shock, suffocating her life from within. Her arm hung limply and unnaturally to the floor, a state of complete loss of muscle tone that medical professionals assert only occurs when the body has given up control of movement. The most chilling thing was the open handbag next to the sofa, where truth and lies lay intertwined. A vial of insulin she had used. The drug for diabetes lay next to pieces of foil containing white powder, a stimulant used to mask pain and fatigue. Hollywood quickly cleaned up the scene, sealed the records, and declared her death was due to illness, but the pale smile in the photograph remains a painful scar. It's a chilling revelation that Linda Jones didn't die of diabetes. She died from an overdose of euphoria and the coldness of those who treated the lives of artists as cheap fuel to light up the stage. The Leica M4 camera stolen on a fall night in Manhattan in 1980 not only took away Mitty Collier's personal property, but also inadvertently opened the terrifying Pandora's box of the entertainment industry. When a photo developer secretly copied the film and released it on the black market, the public was shocked to realize that the radiant beauty often seen on album covers was a spectacular deception. The photograph was no longer art. It was a dark indictment recording the final hours of a rose crushed by Hollywood to extract the last drops of profit. In that black and white frame, Mitty is smiling warmly at an upscale party, but the bounce flash inadvertently becomes the traitor, exposing her neck and collarbone. Instead of smooth skin, the lens captures a network of dark tracks and inflamed, swollen patches of skin. The cruel truth was revealed. To maintain her energy for continuous, non-stop performances, she was forced by the moguls to use high doses of stimulants to burn her heart and nervous system to the point of exhaustion. The cruelty of the Hollywood machine went far beyond a simple addiction. Leaked internal documents showed that the record label knew Mitty was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But instead of saving her, they hired a private medical staff, whose sole purpose was to inject her with powerful painkillers and sedatives backstage so she could stay afloat until the final recording was complete. The drugs weren't for treatment. They were a form of chemical fuel to keep the money-making machine running until the insurance policy expired. A cold-blooded calculation that turned a genius into a cheap consumable. The fateful photograph from the lost camera exposed the medical signs that the post-production techniques of the time couldn't detect. In the harsh lighting, Mitty's eyes were wide open with maximally dilated pupils, mydriasis, showing no sign of constriction, proving her brain had been completely disconnected by the pure chemicals. Even more haunting was the slightly blurred detail of her hand holding the wine glass. This wasn't a technical error in photography, but evidence of tremors, a severe damage to the autonomic nervous system. Hollywood spent enormous sums of money hunting down and destroying all negatives of this film reel to erase the truth. But leaked copies persisted as an indelible stain, proving that Mitty Collier wasn't absent because she wanted to distance herself from the spotlight. She was exploited to the bone, discarded like a broken toy the moment the final note echoed in the recording studio. A rose had been robbed of its life by the very hands that had once promised to elevate her to the pinnacle of glory.
Bitterly, an Oscar icon was pushed into addiction by Hollywood and ended their shame with a fatal overdose.
In our memory, Dorothy Dandridge was the first black woman to be nominated for an Oscar for Best Actress. An icon of pride, but behind the glamorous gowns lay a humiliating reality. Even at the height of her fame in the early 1960s, performing in the opulent casinos of Las Vegas, she was not allowed to use the restrooms shared with white people. This repeated humiliation drove Dorothy into a secret addiction for survival. Candid photos taken at Vegas backstage parties in 1963 revealed it all. Dorothy sat there with a vacant stare, her face pale from water retention, the result of a long-term abuse of high doses of tranquilizers and antidepressants to numb the pain of reality. The most sordid truth was revealed in the final audio recording found after her death in September 1965. Instead of a smooth singing voice, listeners heard only ragged breaths and panicked confessions about being turned into a chemical puppet by Hollywood. In a drug-induced delirium, Dorothy confessed that she couldn't close her eyes without ingesting handfuls of drugs, nor could she smile in front of the camera without stimulants. Hollywood knew Dorothy was rotting from the inside, but instead of saving her, they exploited her chemical dependence to easily manipulate her, forcing her to perform to exhaustion in the most cruelly discriminatory environments. When Dorothy's body was found in her West Hollywood apartment on September 8, 1965, the press hastily reported that she died of a blood clot from a broken bone, a clumsy script to cover up the true medical examination results. The truth lies in the blood test results showing an excessively high concentration of tranquilizers and the photographs from the scene depicting empty pill bottles scattered across the dressing table. Dorothy Dandridge died alone, leaving behind a powerful indictment of Hollywood's cruelty, where a legend was stripped of her humanity and ultimately murdered by the very pills she was forced to choose as her only escape. The Minix B miniature spy camera in the hands of a trainee officer at Metropolitan Hospital in 1959 didn't just capture a medical moment. It stole the last breath of an icon. That photograph was a horrifyingly stark reality that Hollywood vowed to bury alive, Lady Day. Billie Holiday didn't die in the embrace of music. She died in the confinement of shackles and chemicals. Behind the timeless jazz melodies lay a black hole of high-concentration heroin that her masters had dug for her decades ago. Instead of redemption, Hollywood turned the addiction into a noose to tighten its grip on her life and death. Secret files from the night shift nurses uncovered a cold-blooded scenario. While Billie was writhing in delirium from withdrawal, agents secretly injected her with low-maintenance doses. The purpose wasn't to alleviate pain, but to keep her hands from trembling, to lucid enough to sign the copyright transfer documents, a case of exploiting a corpse while the victim was still breathing. The spy camera exposed the medical vulnerabilities that record companies always concealed with thick layers of makeup. In the dim light of the hospital room, Billie's eyes were wide open with pinpoint pupils, irrefutable evidence of a powerful opioid injection. Her skin was oily and ashen, a sign of diaphoresis, a condition where the liver and kidneys were completely paralyzed, unable to filter the deadly fuel destroying her body. The cruelty reached its peak in the detail of her swollen, dark legs with a network of necrotic scars along the dead veins. When there was no more room left for needles in her arms, she was forced to seek out the most sensitive areas of her skin to receive the chemicals. Hollywood deliberately publicized her downfall as a political case to destroy the reputation of a black icon, while secretly squeezing out her last signatures on her deathbed. That photograph, sealed for 30 years, is a powerful indictment. They needed a fallen legend to maximize commercial value rather than a flesh and blood human being desperately pleading for help. Walla Walla, 1966. Behind the stone walls of a reformatory, a daring ray, charried by a paparazzi photographer disguised as a police officer, exposed a hidden corner of music history that had almost overlooked. The black and white film, capturing the figure of Little Willie John, the man who once taught the world how to sing soul, was now just a gaunt, listless shadow with wide, vacant eyes. Gone were the polished suits. The leaked photograph was irrefutable evidence of a genius being stripped of his dignity by chemicals in a dark prison cell. The heart attack death in 1968, announced by authorities, was actually a smokescreen concealing a far more sordid truth. The Walla Walla photograph showed that Willie John did not die of illness. He was turned into a guinea pig for experiments with high-dose nerve-inhibiting drugs. To suppress the delusions arising from his exile, the system used drugs to brainwash him, transforming a brilliant musical mind into a mindless entity. Hollywood knew all this, but they chose to remain silent to continue profiting from the royalties of a shackled legend. The medical indictment lay etched on the artist's flesh. His eyes, wide open with pupils dilated to their maximum extent, remained motionless under the flashing lights, a stark sign of central nervous system paralysis caused by the overuse of sedatives. Most horrifying were the bizarre bruises along his neck, the result of acute muscle spasms, dystonia. Under the unconscious mechanical stress of the drug's side effects, tiny blood vessels had ruptured, leaving agonizing marks that no natural explanation could justify. The chilling, subtle hint is the complete breakdown in his gaze, a soul destroyed before the body could even disintegrate. Hollywood squeezed out his innate talent, then calmly watched him being devoured by dark medical experiments behind bars. This photograph, sealed for decades, is a stark reminder of an era where black talent was treated as disposable. Brilliant on stage, but discarded into chemical silos the moment the lights went out. These 23 haunting images of addiction, long kept hidden by Hollywood, stand as the saddest evidence of the truth behind the glamour. They prove that our black artists were not just fighting a war with addiction. They were victims of a system perfectly willing to let them rot in drugs, so long as they could still stand on that stage as a magnificent money-making machine. If these devastating truths have touched your heart, please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications. Join us as we pull back the velvet curtain to look once more at the hidden shadows and the untold lives of these black legends.